City provide us some information on the women who are living at Fort St. Joseph. But before we get into that, I just wanted to shout out to some of the students. I don't know if you realize, but we had a little bit of a late start this year. We haven't been able to excavate too far down, but we do have some exciting finds from the field, and we thought we would share those with you today if you're interested. Okay, so let's see. From the middle unit in our trench, Paige and Ava, what'd you guys find today?
Gun flint.
A gun flint. What kind of gun flint? Do you remember the type?
It's a honey color, so it was
honey colored. So we thought it might have been fresh. What about how it was made? So we talked about there was the spall or blade, and we figured out how to remember which one. The spall type gun flint. Yep. So that was pretty cool. And we were only like 10 centimeters down at that point, so it was a pretty good find. But we have even a better find. I know, didn't think it was possible. Brandy and Tyler, any of you guys want to share?
We found a lead seal.
A lead seal. So if you don't know, lead seals, they are marking what types of cloth are coming over or goods. So it's kind of like a clothing tag of the past, you could think of it that way. So this one was really cool because it has a palm tree and a crocodile on it, so it's very unique. We haven't found one like that here at Fort St. Joseph. It's also really small, and it comes from Nice. I talked to Catherine Davis, the person that helps us identify a lot of our lead seals from Fort St. Joseph, and she actually said that it was probably for stockings. So there was marking the bringing of stockings over most likely wool. And she dated it to be about around the first half of the 18th century, and she was thinking more around 1715, 1740, she thought, based on what she could see. So that's pretty exciting. It's a great first find now that we've been out on the site. And how more appropriate, too, that we're talking about women, we have something that might have evidence of women wearing, because she said that they could be either wool stockings or it might have been silk, but she thought wool was a little bit more common at that time period. But so she's very much looking forward to coming down to see her stocking. So, yeah, nice job, students. So, without any further ado, Michael, if you want to come up and present on us, I don't think that he needs a big formal introduction because we all know how much knowledge he has, and I don't think that anything would do him justice at this point after 25 years at the site, right? So.
Thank you.
All right, Michael, whenever you're ready.
I'm ready. Can you hear me okay? Good, getting some sound from my system here. Always nice to talk about Fort St. Joseph and to talk to my friends, familiar faces here at Niles, and always some new faces as well. I want to spend about almost an hour or so tonight talking about some research I've been doing for several years. Actually, about 10 or 15 years ago, the very first booklet in our booklet series was focused on the women of New France. So we looked more broadly at women throughout New France. And now we're sort of honing in on the women at Fort St. Joseph. So it's my pleasure to be here. And I should also say that, archaeologists seldom work alone. Right? They often work in collaboration with other archaeologists, field school students, and the like. So this research was conducted with the assistance of Erica Hartley, as well as Professor Jose Antonio Brandao, my colleague in the history department. So they're practically co-authors on this work, but they told me that I could present tonight. So here I am. So here's just a few of the talking points I wanted to cover this evening. I want to step back a little bit and talk about the different types of archaeology first off. As you could imagine, archaeology is conducted throughout the world at different time periods, from different perspectives, different orientations, and so on. So obviously we spend a whole semester just focused on that, but I just want to give you a brief thumbnail sketch of the different types of archaeology, so we can situate the archaeology that I do and that we do here at Fort St. Joseph. And I want to talk about the work of finding hidden histories and explain a little bit about what that means. So the history that we learn in textbooks, textbooks only 300 or 400 or 500 pages long, it misses and leaves out lots of information. So the question always for me is, what's being left out of the history, right? What are the hidden histories that maybe have been intentionally erased or inadvertently ignored? But we want to bring some of those histories to light because they're very important in understanding the more complete society and culture that inhabited Fort St. Joseph. And then, of course, we're going to hone in on Fort St. Joseph as a case study. And I'm not going to go through blow by blow of, everything we've learned about the place in 25 years of research, as well as all the documentary work that's been done. But I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch there to provide a context for understanding the topic this evening, which is the women of Fort St. Joseph. So, we can define archaeology in lots of different ways, but a pretty brief definition here, and we could define it in other ways, but we could call it the science of who did what in the past. Of course, it's the entry point into that past is through the material record, right? We're interested in the materiality, the detritus of everyday life that people left, the animal bones, the rusty nails, the broken pottery, and so on. But what we want to know is what happened in the past and who did it, in a nutshell. So one type of archaeology has been referred to for many, many years and is still to some extent, although the term is falling out of favor, is so-called prehistoric archaeology. So this is archaeology of ancient societies who generally lacked written records. So in different parts of the world, it's at different times, right? I mean, there are written records in ancient Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. Here in Michigan, the first written records emerged with the French in the 17th century. So anyway, that's one type of archaeology, and there's been lots of work done in Michigan on the more ancient past, the people who lived here before Europeans showed up and started writing things down. It's not that these people didn't have history, it's just that they existed before written records were recording history. There's classical archaeology, right? So this is ancient Rome and Greece and so on, right? Archaeology of the Eastern Mediterranean, generally speaking, kind of a time and a place. There's environmental archaeology, a focus on the environmental context, people and landscape interactions, for example, right? That's a whole other type of archaeology, some of which we touch on in trying to understand the work at Fort St. Joseph. There's geoarchaeology, looking at the geological and sedimentological context of archaeological finds as well. Now we're getting closer to what we do, historical archaeology. So this is archaeology, generally speaking, of the last 500 years, developed pretty much in North America, looking at the invasion of Europeans, so the French and the British and the Spanish and their interactions with indigenous peoples in the Americas. And since the formation of the formalization of historical archaeology in the 1960s, the discipline is now spread to be of global interest. So there's historical archaeology in South Africa, in Ireland, in the Philippines, and so on. There's industrial archaeology, a smaller segment of historical archaeology that focuses on the industrial period, the places where people in the industrial era lived and worked, right? So there's a lot of this work happening in the UP, right? Michigan Tech does this sort of work. And Aiden, I was talking to Aiden earlier, and she was engaged in some industrial archaeology when she was looking at a copper mine in the UP as well. There's even now what's called contemporary archaeology. So this is archaeology of the most recent past within the living history of all of us, right? So it could be asking your grandfather about, Vietnam or something like that, or asking your neighbor about what this neighborhood looked like, before they built the Walmart here, these sorts of things. But again, with anthropological perspective and an archaeological view towards understanding that most recent history. As a matter of fact, in the COVID year, when we didn't do the field school, in lieu of the field school, I taught a course online at Western called, in essence, the archaeology of COVID-19, where we actually focused on the contemporary materiality of the COVID pandemic. So it doesn't have to even be, not only not far away, but not also need not be long ago to be of interest. And then there's social archaeology, and that's what I do. And that doesn't mean that I'm just like a social guy, right? But it means that I'm interested in the social relations in the past. So these could be various identities that existed in the past, along class lines or gender or along racialized identities. It can also point out that archaeology takes place within a social context, right? And at different moments, at different historical moments, social and political circumstances influence the way we interpret the past. So this is something that I've been particularly interested in, and it's what's driven a lot of my research at Fort St. Joseph, trying to understand in particular what happened when the French and Native peoples interacted. How did their social relations change their lives? How did the material adoptions change who they were fundamentally as well? And who was actually living at Fort St. Joseph, and what material objects did they leave behind to tell us about their lives? So with regard to finding hidden histories, there are problems with written records. Written records don't tell us everything. For one reason, because basically not everybody who had a story to tell could write it down. So you can bet if you rely on somebody else to write about your life, they may not see it the same way you see yourself. Right? So for a long time, even though we've had written records, they've really only covered a segment of the population, or were written from the perspective of a segment of the population. So it's often important to ask ourselves, who wrote these documents and what was their purpose? So for example, when priests came to North America, Jesuit priests, much of what they were interested in was saving souls and converting people. What do you think they might have written to their superiors in France about the success of their mission? Well, if they wanted to ensure that they were going to continue to get the support, they probably told them it's going pretty well. We're getting converts. So that might be partly true, but we have to remember who's doing the writing and who the audience is. So that's something to take into consideration. The other piece then, in terms of who wrote, well, I mean, Jesuits were educated men, white, educated men. Most of the people until compulsory education in the US, right, which began in the 19th century, were mostly white, educated men. And, I'm a white, educated man, so, it's not such a bad thing, but if the perspective is only coming from that segment of the population, then they're leaving out people. So, with regard to that, let me just make one other point. I mean, some of the people then that were being left out would be like, for example, the enslaved. A lot of people were enslaved in North America and in South America. They were prohibited to learn to read and write. Right? So many of their stories are lost. Or maybe their enslavers were writing about them, but you can imagine what they were saying about them. Probably not the way that people thought of themselves. The working class, right, in industrial sites, many of the working class, because they were spending 16 hours a day on the shop floor, they weren't coming home and writing in their diaries necessarily, right? So a lot of their lived experience as well is lost because they weren't writing about their everyday lives. Their employers might have been writing about them, and you can imagine what they were saying. Lazy, et cetera, right? You can give it some thought. I'm not going to get into it right now. Another segment of the population that went underrepresented and about half the population easily would be women. Right? So it's not to say that we have no written documents from women at any time, but they are sorely underrepresented. Right? And when we learn about them, we also learn about them from the perspective of the dominant culture. So, luckily for us, in order to find hidden histories, there are ancillary sources of historical data. Right? There are other sources of information. Right? So some of them can be oral accounts. So my grandmother used to tell me that her grandmother told her this is what it was like going to the local general store or whatever the store is, or what it was like to churn butter, what it was like to live on the farm and get up at 4:30 in the morning to collect eggs, or whatever the stories are. Now, oral accounts are only going to take us back so far. But they can be valuable in some contexts. They can be maps. It's a written source, but different in some ways than narrative text. Could be paintings. Could be old baskets, or the old butter churn itself that's in the corner of the barn that we can look at and see how it was made. Maybe get a sense of how it worked and so on, and learn a little bit about what it was like to use that particular item. And then there's the detritus of everyday life, right? The little bits of daily life, what Jim Dietz calls small things forgotten. Broken potsherds and rusty nails and brick fragments and bits of glass that people select and use in particular ways, often to express who they are. Right? So you can maybe think about some of the things in your own households, right? How they express who you are. There might be gendered spaces in your household, right? The man cave, or a sewing corner, or a place where, again, maybe male or female activities, and there's non-binary spaces as well that we can recognize today, right? So people use objects to express who they are, and that's why we can, as archaeologists, can recover these materials and sort of, what's the term there for going backward with engineering there? What is that? Reverse engineering, is it? Yeah, so we can kind of reverse engineer them, what they were doing, in a sense. So you probably know the story of New France. So I'm not going to go into much detail here, except to say that the French didn't control, but at least they settled a large area of North America. And their goal was to hem the British colonies in along the eastern seaboard. They did a pretty good job at that, but only with the assistance of native allies. There just weren't that many French compared to the British. About 70,000 French, about 1.3 million British citizens on the eve of the American Revolution. So the French allied with natives, and for that reason, they were able to establish themselves and, as I said, keep the British at bay until the French and Indian War, and we'll get to that in a minute. So here's some of our favorite reenactors, of course, at Fort St. Joseph. We know the French were here to proselytize, to convert native peoples to Christianity, to Catholicism. They were here with a small military presence, and they were here also with commercial interests. Right? We often say that the fur trade, the exchange of goods like cloth and iron implements and glass beads and so on for furs was the glue that was foundational to the alliances between the French and the natives. So, in regards to the people of New France, those are sort of the three, almost like the three estates, if you will, the military, the religious, and these commercial interests. There were women at Fort St. Joseph as well, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about this today. There were women in New France, so let's not even get to Fort St. Joseph yet. But not a lot, not many. In the 1660s, the French sent his filles de roi, the daughters of the king. He sent about 300 of them or so to Quebec. These were women who were orphaned or otherwise didn't have life opportunities, and they came to New France with the idea of populating the colony. So as low density as the population was of New France, there were even fewer numbers of women, which was problematic for what they had hoped would be a growing colony. So in regards to the historical background, I mean, you know a little bit about this already at Fort St. Joseph. You know when it was established. You know that the French were here until the British gained control, and really then the French still stayed here. And after the Anglo-Indian War, otherwise known as Pontiac's Rebellion, the British did not re-garrison the fort. And there were about 15 households, French households here until 1780. When they were deported to Michilimackinac, there was a concern that when George Rogers Clark came up from the Illinois country here, that some of these French families might align with them, and so they deported them to Michilimackinac. And after a day of the Spanish raid, the fort was soon abandoned in about 1782. 1841, until local farmers found artifacts in the fields in the 1830s, and local historians started collecting those in the late 19th century, and then it took about another century before WMU came on the scene, and we started the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project, when we actually found the site with the help of documents by Joe Pizer that allowed us to definitively state that Fort St. Joseph is in Niles along the banks of the river, where we've been working for the last 25 years. So, I mentioned some of the folks who occupied the fort. There were probably 50 or 60 people there at any one time. This is a very accurate map, as it turns out, that was drawn in 1762. Actually, the site was visited then. This map was drawn about 15 years later by Thomas Hutchins. But it shows not only the fort, but 200 Potawatomi men across the river. So there was a lot of activity in that particular area. This was a very important location for the French. And in fact, when there was a glut of furs that led the crown to closing lots of forts throughout the region, they kept this one open because it was politically important for the interests of the crown. So let's get into a little bit of the historical methods here, so we can talk about that, how we did the work. So those of you who are interested in doing historical archaeological research, this is one model. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but you might think about this. So we began our documentary research by examining the roles that French-Canadian women conducted in New France. Right? Because there was a gender imbalance, as I mentioned, French women's lives in North America were not mere replicas of those in France. Women in New France arguably had greater latitude for power, self-expression, and authority due to the flexibility of gender roles and economic necessity. So 17th and 18th century French women were socialized to perform labor specific to their gender. Women were taught to become dutiful wives, mothers, and members of society, which required learning various household skills, such as tending poultry and small animals, preparing dairy products, beer and bread, growing flax, making linen and wool cloth, gardening, sewing and mending clothes, cooking, cleaning, and caring for children. So what we did is consulted a vast amount of literature and just looked at some of the tasks and roles that women conducted in France, in New France, sometimes in one or the other, and so on. So for example, something like, a baker in France, we're not sure that women exclusively bake necessarily in New France. But anyway, in New France, most economic activity, male and female, was based around the home. Unless the person worked in the distant fur trade, commerce, or for the crown, household activities included subsistence farming and small-scale exchange of goods and services. Women were integral to the maintenance of the household and the raising of the family, even as they supported their husbands and his business ventures. In New France, women's roles were more fluid than men's. It was more common for women to assist in the fields than it was for men to perform domestic tasks. Women were more involved in business than previously thought. They appear in notarial records as participants in the fur trade, where they acquired trade goods and even used their personal fortunes to purchase such goods. They also supplied and transported produce and bought and sold real estate, clear evidence of female agency in a patriarchal society. So what about some of the documentary evidence of women now specifically at Fort St. Joseph? Well, among the sources we consulted to identify women at Fort St. Joseph were church records of marriage, birth, and baptism, genealogies, and a variety of other documents such as lists of trade goods and expense reimbursement records. Now, we're not going to get into the specifics of individuals from a genealogical perspective, but we did collect some of that data, and we could talk about that at some other time. So the goal was to enumerate the women who lived at the post, their age at marriage, the number of births, roles as godmothers, and literacy rates. And we're going to summarize some of the findings, beginning with those data that allow us to compare the women at Fort St. Joseph with those elsewhere in France before describing women's economic activities. So we identified some 72 women associated with the fort, most of whom were born in New France. Comparative data only exists for some 38 women who actually lived at the fort, 11 of whom were Métis, and 1 was Native American. So 11 of the 38 women gave birth to 77 children, 7 on average, 57 of which were baptized. 4 women had 10 or more children. We can determine the age at which 18 women at Fort St. Joseph were first married, and you can see those data here. The youngest at age 15 here, and the oldest at age 29. The median age was about 20, and 27 women served as godmothers. So limited records of women's economic activities point to their participation in an informal economy. Women, mostly widows, were granted permission to trade to Fort St. Joseph, although they probably did not reside there. The wives of fort commanders were often in charge of their husbands' affairs, as they, unlike their husbands, mostly remained in the main colony and made arrangements with merchants to carry out the trade licensed to the post leaders. We surmise that men and women at the fort traded with local Native Americans for furs and then sold those furs to either the post commander or others licensed to trade at the post for goods for their own use and or to trade for more furs. Such activity would serve to sustain social and economic relations with local Native peoples. Women also provided post commanders and Jesuit missionaries with supplies such as livestock, snowshoes, ribbon, and canoes. In addition to supplying provisions and engaging in trade, women likely farmed, milked, baked, laundered, and sewed. While these activities are not evident in the documentary records at Fort St. Joseph, some may have left material evidence that can be discerned archaeologically. Okay, so far we've sort of talked about what can we garner from the documents about women. Now we're going to drill down a little bit more on the archaeological evidence of women at Fort St. Joseph. So research on Fort St. Joseph has intensified over the past 2 decades with the archaeological discovery of the site and subsequent investigations. The focus has been on understanding the spatial structure of the archaeological deposits to infer the activities and identities of the fort's multi-ethnic community, including the contributions of women. A number of women's activities required implements for their performance. So this is a map that Erica and Jason created, graphic artists based on Erica's research, and it shows a number of the houses and structures at the site. And these are useful sort of units of analysis for us, right? Because again, archaeologists want to understand material evidence, and I also should have added material evidence in context. So for example, if all the straight pins we found at the site appeared and occurred in one house, that would mean something very different than if there were 20 here and 20 here and 20 here and so on, right? So that's something we want to pay attention to. So this looks like a pretty busy chart, table, but let me tell you what it includes here. These are those tasks and roles that we saw earlier, and the setting that we also saw earlier. And these are specialized implements and associated artifacts that would be necessary to perform some of those activities. So you can glance at that for a second. And then in the second column from the right are artifacts found at Fort St. Joseph. Right? So it'd be as if we said, well, a carpenter needs, a hammer and a screwdriver, and we find a hammer and a screwdriver at Fort St. Joseph, then that's evidence of a carpenter. So we're suggesting these are activities and objects that women would have used, and these are the ones that we have found at Fort St. Joseph. Although we can't be certain that women exclusively engaged in these activities, it seems likely that women were certainly needed and able to conduct various tasks in this frontier setting. By juxtaposing these objects in context with the extant documentary records, we're obtaining a better understanding of the activities of women at Fort St. Joseph in support of their families, the colony, and the crown. So I'm going to make an argument for a number of these objects as being linked to women here. So archaeological excavations have uncovered significant quantities of goods intended for trade and use in daily life, such as glass beads, iron knives, lead seals. We heard about the lead seal found today. Needles, scissors, straight pins, and thimbles. And here's some of the examples of those objects. Right? Here's some finger rings, thimbles, another finger ring. These are brooches, lead seal, straight pins, and a fastener. So sewing, needlework, and cloth production were important activities in the lives of most women, and associated artifacts often serve as symbols of female identity. Sewing implements are arguably indicative of women at Fort St. Joseph. For example, straight pins relate to active clothing production processes such as sewing and served as fasteners for women's clothing and wrappings. A total of 154 pins have been recovered from the fort in varying states of completeness. So here's some of the objects that are associated with sewing. And here we have a number of the house sites and structures, and then this says non-structure. And what we're looking at here, we have the volume of soil excavated from each of these, so we can standardize the density. In other words, let's say we had dug 10 cubic meters here and 1 cubic meter here. Well, the numbers of objects found in those two locations are not directly comparable unless we standardize the volume of earth moved, okay? So I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but I want to just point out some patterns, because that's what archaeologists like to do. They want to collect data, they want to look for patterns, and then they want to try to interpret those patterns. So let's just look at straight pins, for example. So here's these various counts, and there's the percent, and here's the density. So what that's telling us, first off, is that with the exception of structure 6 and structure 2, there's a good number of straight pins that are found in each of those houses. So it begs the question, well, what's going on in structure 6 and what's going on in structure 2? Why the paucity there? Is it related to less excavation? Is it something else going on there? Maybe is it not as many women there? Maybe it's not occupied as long? Or questions we could ask. Also notice this, if we look at the non-structure, right? Non-structure artifacts are here, and these are all the houses and structures. We'll notice that The volume of soil, 53% is from non-structure excavation. So about half of the excavation is not in buildings, and about half is in those other buildings. Okay? But when we look at the straight pins, we'll notice there's only 21% of the straight pins are from outside the structures. So the straight pins are predominantly, 79% of them, in the structures themselves. So these are the kinds of, what does that mean exactly? We got to sort through that and think about what that might mean. But we're looking for patterns and trying to explain the patterns. But generally what this tells us is it looks like if these are indeed objects associated with women, except, where there's really small counts, we only found one partial pair of scissors. So we can't say much about that. But for the rest of these, there's decent numbers here, particularly here, then we can begin to say that it looks like women are probably occupying at least 4 of these 6 structures. So these pins occur in greater than average frequencies in 4 of the 6 buildings to date at the fort. Other objects implicated in making and repairing clothing, like awls, needles, thimbles, and scissors, also appear sporadically throughout the site. Of the 9 thimbles recovered, only 3 are complete enough to determine their size, which accords with those used by women. Right? So people have different sized fingers. Right? Male tailors are going to have bigger thimbles than women's hands and children's hands, generally speaking. Small sample size, but suggestive. Gendered activities are also expressed in the context of certain material trends. So, for example, there's a large assortment of gun parts that were found in proximity to one of the structures. These are almost certainly associated with the blacksmith. And in another area of the site, here at structure 2, in front of this fireplace, we found this large concentration of glass beads, which probably is associated with embroidering garments and so on in front of this fireplace. Again, also indicative of female activities. Other recovered materials that implicate women include a hoe, large needles for stretching hides, cakes or butchering knives, and various storage and food preparation containers. So personal adornment and clothing-related artifacts and habitations occupied by French and Canadian families at the fort, most notably clothing, fasteners, and jewelry, can also be used to infer gendered activity. So here we're looking at personal adornment and clothing-related items, like hook and eye fasteners, bracelets, brooches, and rings. So for example, buckles and buttons are the most common type of personal adornment artifacts from the fort, but they're neither gender specific nor associated exclusively with women. Men's clothing generally had buttons, women's clothing generally did not. So they were fastening them with little hooks and eyes and with little pins to keep them closed up. Women's garments were likely fastened, as I said, with hooks and eyes, which have been recovered from the fort. Some 22 of them. They occur at greater frequencies in House 2 and structures 3 and 4. Excuse me. Some forms of jewelry, such as beads, earrings, and nose bobs, were worn by both men and women, whereas bracelets and brooches are associated with women. Women probably wore the simple copper alloy C-shaped wire types of bracelets found at the fort, as well as brooches from across the site. So brooches here, some 28 of them. Again, only occurring in small numbers in some places, but outside the structure, 11 of them. In House 2, 9 of them, 4 of them in Structure 4. Finger rings, you saw an example earlier, Here's some examples of them. Vary in size according to the age and gender of the wearer. So of the 37 ring bands and fragments recovered, 19 of them could be sized and would fit children, women, and men. So this is the size, the ring size here, and this is the frequency. So 2 of these, 4 of these, and so on. So the greater frequency of smaller ring sizes, you can see most of these are 7 and below, indicate that women and children adorn themselves with finger rings more often than men. So these are likely women or children's rings. Okay, in summing up, research at Fort St. Joseph, a French colonial outpost, can reveal the ways in which gendered identities were enacted in a frontier setting. Documentary sources provide information on several women living at Fort St. Joseph, including their age in marriage, their family size, economic activities, the baptism of children and women frequently serving as godmothers of the fort suggests that many women remain committed to their religious faith. Their upbringing in the colony prepared them to assist their husbands in the fur trade, raise animals that could be sold, and use their property rights to participate more fully in the colonial economy. At a different scale of resolution, the archaeological record reveals many of the daily activities of women at the fort and how they displayed their identities. Material evidence of clothing and personal adornment, along with various other implements, indicate that women conducted new and traditional activities like sewing, stretching hides, and preparing unfamiliar foods. It appears that women were well equipped to succeed on the frontier of New France. They were able to conduct many of their old cultural practices in support of colonialism, even as they adapted to new conditions brought about by the fur trade and their peripheral geographic location. Women were also opportunistic in contributing to the domestic economy, where they were most influential and able to assert themselves. With so much at stake, women remained responsible for the household sphere, where they inculcated cultural values to future generations of French Canadians and helped to ensure a vast and enduring Francophone presence in North America. That's what I know about the women of Fort St. Joseph. Thank you.
Anything that you'd like to discuss or maybe elaborate on, we can take those.
I hope so. I came all the way from South Haven for this. Yes, Jay.
Has anyone anywhere else done anything similar to this so that we're going to compare it with like excavations in Louisiana, Kaskaskia, Cahokia, all these other places?
Yeah, Jay is asking if there's been any other work done like this. I like the way you think, Jay, because as one author says, the study of colonialism is a comparative project. In other words, the idea is to compare what's going on at Fort St. Joseph with Michilimackinac, with Louisiana. Some of this work has been done at Michilimackinac, and there's been a little bit of work done in Louisiana as well. But it's their roles are gonna vary in different locations, obviously. And so here we've got a nice opportunity to look at this specific place, right? Because we've got the material record and we've got the documents. Yes, Aiden?
Did you find anything you weren't expecting to find out?
Did we find anything that we weren't expecting to find out? Let me think about that for a second. I think, when we were working in the field, I tended to assign a lot of the objects to men. Whenever we would find something, we'd find a lead seal. Oh, it's part of training activity. We'd find, a knife. Oh, they were cutting something. Men were cutting something, or this and that. And then, I don't know, it hit me pretty suddenly that almost all of those objects could just as easily be attributed to women. We just hadn't been looking at them that way. So I think that was revealing, I think. We start the longer version of the paper saying that the fur trade has been looked at, the fur trade and forts have been looked at from the perspective of gunflints and smoking pipes and trade goods and traders and all that sort of thing. And women have very much been relegated to the background. But in fact, as you scratch beneath the surface, so to speak, metaphorically, I mean, they are there and they're making very, very important contributions to the colonial venture. Christine?
Is there anything that you found in material evidence that either contradicts or sheds new light, or where it just really competes with the written record, or the history that was handed down to you?
So kind of a version, I guess, of what he was asking too. Does it it's funny, I was just reading some of John Chenoweth's work, and he calls something like that gotcha archaeology. So in other words, this contradicts. And, I don't know, I knew enough about what women were doing before we started doing the work. So it was kind of just constructing it from the ground up. Do you have any insights on it, Erica? I mean, I think I was kind of just looking at it as sort of gender neutral initially. And so this gave us an opportunity to kind of parse out a little bit more. So which of these objects in the households were sure? Which of these objects in the households can we actually attribute to women?
No, the statement.
Say when.
Oh, this, okay. So one thing that I noticed when I was helping him gather data for this is that the statement, so you notice he talked about how there was limited in structure 3. So we're looking based on the evidence of structure 3 and 4, we're thinking that that's where the blacksmith was living at. That's where the evidence is pointing to. But structure 4, where we think maybe was more of the workshop due to the metal cache, the window that was right there, the broken items, all of that the archaeology points to in structure 4 has 38 statements.
Yeah, you feel good.
And you look at structure 3, where we think is the domestic part of that has 2. So if she's living in structure 3, because we know our blacksmith had a wife, she was on site, they had a whole bunch of children. Why is there 2 where we think their house is, but there's 38 where we think the workshop is? Is he maybe repairing them? Are they broken? Does she keep them in a different place and she took them with her? What's happening there? So I think that's one thing that we could look a little bit further into, is why is that different? I mean, they're not saying that he couldn't be using them, but I would think that they're mainly used to hold up your clothing, at least from what I gather from the living history reenactors. Why are we only finding 2 in her everyday setting? You would easily drop them.
So, the way to turn that on its head is if 38 straight pins, what did we say there? 38 straight pins, are we over here?
Yeah, structure 4.
Right, and the density is this high, then what's going on in structure 4? Maybe it's something different.
I don't know.
It raises.
Where did they get the pins from? Did they come from France, or were they making them on the spot?
They're bringing them in from France. They're too small. I think it would be really hard for him to make them.
Yeah, and they're practically disposable.
It's like a bomb. I would think I lose them all the time, you know? So-
I mean, they're like little straight pins today, or safety pins, or, you know, they're practically disposable, so. So that raises questions about what structure 4 might be. Yeah.
So, do we have any like record of, like you said, like the blacksmith had a family and children? Is there any way we can place, like a personal record to the structure?
We have not been able to do that yet. Our site doesn't have that much detail in the map. Well, we don't have a map of what specifically the site would look like. Whereas Michelin-Mackinac, they're able to say this person lived here in this house from this time. But we don't have that for St. Joseph.
They only found that map about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but it's a very detailed map. It's a long house, the Lot Binier map. And, you know, Perrin lives here, and Solomon lives here, and Chevalier lives here, but we don't have anything like that. So we're using the archaeology to try to reconstruct who was occupying these various buildings.
So, guessing that the blacksmith had, wife and children, like, was it from the things that have been found in this area?
So we know that he had a wife and children from the historical documents that we do have. So we have those records, the baptismal and marriage records of some people from the site. It's not complete. But from what I did for my thesis is I looked at all the features found, and in structure 3 and 4, structure 3 very much resembled houses 1 and 2. The fireplaces were open, they looked very similar, so I thought, okay, this is more of a residence area. And structure 4's fireplace feature was much bigger, the rocks are ginormous compared to the other ones. It didn't quite resemble the same type of fireplace.
The library will be closing in 30 minutes, the lab will be closing in 15 minutes.
And there are also a whole bunch of, there was a metal cache that would have possibly fit within there. That was a lot of broken items, a broken axe, broken nails, like just something kind of where he would donate, here's all this iron, if you cannot use it anymore, can you fix it, and or can you use it to create something else? And so that's how I have hypothesized that was his workshop. Well, among other things too. There was a smudge pit I found nearby, and we know that at Weehana, the blacksmith there was also tanning knives. So there's a couple of other factors, but I don't know. I guess we could look at it and go into further detail. That's kind of what it's all about, is testing your hypothesis.
Yeah, and just to add to that piece, so that's how science works, right? So we observed what we thought was a pattern that would suggest this is the blacksmith workshop. Then if you find an inordinate number of straight pins in that area, the first thing you might say is, well, that's an anomaly. You follow what I'm saying? In other words, that doesn't seem right. And it would be dismissed, right? But as one anomaly occurs and then another anomaly occurs, then you have to rethink, right? So the idea was that the sun went around the earth, right? And that fit with the evidence of the day, but then other patterns emerged, other anomalous patterns emerged that forced people to begin to rethink that.
Well, we
Right?
could also look at maybe if all the strip pins are found in the metal cache, they're waiting for use in the future, and then we could still back at our workshop. So just check it out.
Other questions?
All of those samples of pins were bent.
Were they bent?
Yet the pictures they were.
Oh, some of them, yeah.
So they could very easily just all
Yeah,
thrown in a box.
yeah. They weren't all bent like that, but those ones there were, yes. And some of them were straight, but some of them were broken. So.
But you've handled those before, Fred. I mean, they're fairly durable. They're copper alloy. And I don't think it would take too much to straighten them back out, right? I mean, my grandfather would straighten out crooked nails. I mean, you can certainly straighten out those crooked straight nails pretty easily.
Yeah, but it's something that the blacksmith could do better.
Ah,
He has an handle.
okay,
He has a tool that he can use.
gotcha. So hence, the concentration there. Yeah. What do you got, Mary Ellen? So, yeah.
It also was so easy, if they were moving in 1780 maps, they might print their statements. You know, they must show that off, there's a map of who lived where there. Big bunches.
Okay, so she suggested maybe when they left, they took their straight pins with them. Certainly it's possible.
I think they took most of it.
Other questions? Mark, you got anything? All right.
All right, well, if you, I'm sure Dr. Tang will hang around for a little bit longer if you have any questions. Otherwise, make sure to check out our merchandise area with Carson. We are accepting donations for the brand new t-shirts. They're available, they're back there, check out the colors. If you don't get one today, they'll still be available in just a few weeks. So we'll see you, not this weekend, but the next.
Field students stay here for the TikTok.
What?
We need the field students to stay here.
Oh, and the field school students, see Aiden about, some kind of social media. Awesome. All right, thank you guys for coming. Yeah.